seminars where all lawyers talking to you.
Really?
It's, yeah, you need.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us again. And again, thank you for Jennifer for putting this together. It's always great to have great partners, because that's what makes the world go around. So this week we're gonna talk about Moshe primarily. We're gonna try to talk about also Miriam a little bit. And I really loved last week how it was more laid back and questions, and I want to encourage more questions, and it's always the easiest way to expand and to really get to know what we're talking about is when you have questions. If you don't have a question, you don't have to make one up, so don't worry about it, right? I'll still like you, right? But if you do have a question, don't say like, oh, I don't know. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Every question, if it's something that's bothering you, right, that means to say that that needs explanation. So I encourage again for everybody to please ask any questions. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so let's get cracking. Moshe Rabbeinu. All right, so I'm gonna actually ask you guys the first question. Tell me when you hear of Moshe, right, or as he's known in other places, Moses, right? But when you hear, and not the restaurant, right? When you hear about Moshe, right? There's Moses. There's a famous Moses. Maybe it's in Florida, right? It's not kosher. That's why that was my joke. You know, okay, it wasn't funny. Okay, let's erase and start over again. And Baruch Hashem. McWhat?
No, Rabbi, it's got to be an East Coast thing because we're not from here either. And
so maybe it's an East Coast thing. It's Moses. There's like and no, there's like glasses inside the O's.
Yeah,
I've seen passed by.
Exactly.
Whatever, as a rabbi, we get around. No, I'm just kidding. So when you guys hear about Moshe, right? So I don't want the typical. Oh, he split the sea. He did the plagues. We all know that, right? When you think about Moshe, and I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to stop and think about this, right? What comes to mind? What comes to mind? Go ahead.
Reluctant leader.
Reluctant leader. Okay, good. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Excellent.
He was humble.
Humble. Good. Very good. Okay. Well, he beat you to it, so you have to come up with something else. No, I'm just kidding. Right? Okay. Humble.
He took advice so that he could delegate from Jethro.
Okay. Excellent. He took advice, right? Very good point. Remind me your name again.
Laura.
Laura. Okay.
Prophecy.
Prophecy. Prophecy.
I remember one time Rabbi Mason gave a sermon and was talking about Moshe being, he had speech impairment.
Yes.
He was delegating, he wanted Aaron to speak and he wasn't sure if he could believe.
Right. So you're hitting on a few points. You're hitting on reluctant and also delegate and take advice. Excellent. Very good. Anybody else?
Disappointed with how he ended his life.
Disappointed how he ended his life.
Well, he had a temper too.
One second. I'll take.
I think it was probably for the whole thing. Somebody that oh yes, when he was talking about who should give the baton is on, should say the baton is on. And everyone said it had to be Moshe. And then Moshe said, no, I don't marry.
Because he didn't get into the land of Israel. Right, very good, right. So he had a good death. He had actually the highest level of death. It's called Neshika, right? The death where sort of God, it's a kiss of death. That's where it comes from. It's midrash. Any of these like phrases or like these mystical things, you could typically find something alluding to it in midrash or the Talmud or something. So kiss of death comes from the concept of, it's called one of the death. The Talmud tells us, I don't remember the exact number off by heart right now, but there's a various different kind of deaths. And the highest level of death, means to say the most spiritual way of death, is called Neshika, where it's a kiss of death, where sort of God kisses metaphorically, and the neshama goes with him. So Moshe had the loftiest death, but you're right, Moshe was not able to go to the land of Israel, and he was not happy about that. Good point.
And he actually said, of all these other candidates, of all the candidates that we have here, that They were saying yes. I'm the only one that no time at all in.
In the land of Israel, right, very good. Go ahead.
Where he said, leave me out of this book, don't punish, the ultimate leader, don't punish. our
Right,
people, leave me
don't punish the people, right? Let me, you know, I'm gonna be with them. Very good point, excellent, right? Leave me out and he's actually out of one of the parshiot.
Okay, Rabbi, that, what Joni said, that is what I was gonna say, but from the standpoint that, wasn't God gonna destroy the Jewish
Yes.
people? And he said, you know, he really, talked about it, stood up to him and said, take me out of the book. I go back that now, I said, I think there's so much discord between the Jewish people, there's so much going on that I think Hashem is really upset, and I go, what if he feels that way again? We don't have a Moshe Rabbeinu. I think about that, I'm sure that never comes up, but that does bother me. I know I have to have a mana, but then when my Yetzirah takes over, that is front and center.
So you bring a great point, right? You bring a great point. So first, let's just talk about the point that you brought out when, you know, it was, yes, God was in sort of a tag team over here we have, right? Where God said that because they sinned the Chet Egel, the golden calf, right? That God said, boom, that's it. You guys are done, right? Like, look at this. I took you out of Egypt. I did this. I did the plagues. Mount Sinai, you heard God. They heard God speak, right? Anoch Hashem Elokecha, Hashem your God. Right? The miracles they said was that you could see the words, which is impossible, right? And what's going on? All of a sudden go sin with the golden calf? Not for our discussion how that happens, for a different time. But Moshe Rabbeinu, right, went up to heaven for 40 days, fasted, and he went up to heaven for 40 days to plead for the Jewish people, right? And he said, if you destroy them, right, take me out of your Torah. And so that is a sign of a true leader. And we're going to come back to the other ones, but just take to your next point that you said, how about in our days, right? So we always have to remember, you said we don't have a Moshe Rabbeinu in our days, right? And I'm going to get a little off topic, not necessarily Moshe. It is a leadership, course. So I want to talk about leadership for a second. The Talmud tells us that we find in the Torah, right, that by the mitzvah bikurim, the mitzvah bikurim is in Parshas Kisava, which happens to be my bar mitzvah parsha, right? But in the Parsha Kisava, beginning of mitzvahs bikurim, what is bikurim? Bikurim is the first fruit that ripens on the tree, right? The farmer would go put a little string around it, and then when it ripens or whatever, he takes it off and he'll take the first fruit that from every tree that ripened, bring it up to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple, and he'll say, he brings it sort of like a sacrifice. And it's a tremendous gratitude to God, right, that he gave him. It's a beautiful discussion to talk about, but not our topic today either, right? But it says over there, it says you should bring it to the Kohen of your days, right? Yavo lakon b'yomech. I don't remember the exact Hebrew words, but it says to bring it to the Kohen of your days. And Rashi, right there on the spot, quoting the Talmud, to say bring it to the Kohen. Like, why do you have to say to the Kohen of your days? And like, it's an extra word, right? Why does it say in your days? Why couldn't it just say bring it to the Kohen? And Rashi quotes the Talmud and saying that, and there's other places we find this idea, that someone would say, well, we don't have Aaron anymore. We don't have Shimon HaTzadik, who is the Kohen Gadol, right? That was a tremendous Kohen Gadol. Or we don't have that rabbi. We don't have this. Nowadays, who do we have? Forget it. I'm not bringing the Bikurim to that Kohen, right? Like, come on, that Kohen, he's like, whatever. You notice when he does it, he doesn't really do it properly. No, I'm just kidding, right? But whatever, I'm not going to bring. He's not like such a learned person. He's not such a righteous person, or whatever it is. He's not, or he might be very righteous and very learned, but he's not like the previous generation. The Torah says no. You have to bring it to the Kohen of your days. Every Kohen of your days, every rabbi, every leader of your days is the reason why they're, but yes, they might not be like the generation before, and they're not our Moshe Feinstein, and not our Ricky Veiger, and they're not Rashi, and they're not Moshe, and they're not the rabbis of the Talmud, and they're not Rebbe Akadosh, right? And they're not even, rabbis from just a few years ago, right? Jonathan Sachs, unfortunately, we lost, right? We don't have him anymore. Oh, forget it. We don't have these rabbis anymore. We have to feel the loss, but leadership has to be by Yom Mehem on their days. So yes, we don't have a Moshe Rabbeinu nowadays, but we have to look at our leaders that we do have, the rabbis that we do have, the leaders that we have, and say, hey, we need your help, right? How can we mend things together? And there's great rabbis out there, right, that help, right? That to help men together. We just have to follow their lead, right? Because sometimes the biggest problem is when we don't follow the leader's lead, right? We don't follow the rabbi's lead. We think we know better. We think we can do it this way, we can do it that way. And a lot of times that doesn't happen. And a lot of times that comes from because if the rabbi from 500 years ago would be around now, then I'll listen to that rabbi, Rabbi Kiva Eger, right? Or Jonathan Sachs, right? Some other great rabbis. What does make a difference? Who they are? Oh, those rabbis would listen to it. What do you know? Right? That's a general thing of leadership. I just wanted to, since you made that point, I just wanted to.
Yeah, right.
Right.
And if they didn't listen on Sinai,
Right.
Seeing Hashem,
Exactly.
what makes
Exactly. Okay. Anybody else want to comment? Then we'll move on. Go ahead.
Team building of everybody had to contribute to the Mishkan.
Okay. Very good. We had team building. You got everybody to contribute to the Mishkan. Okay. One more, and then I'll start talking.
So, want to add to what Ryan said, because it wasn't that he just treated for Hashem to forgive the idol, for the calf. He also bargained with Hashem and won an agreement that whatever the Jew might do, you will keep your promise to our disciple, to Abraham, that the Jews will always have Canaan, that they'll always have that he would never give it to another nation. So I heard,
No,
I heard this from the Drash, I never remember from it, but the message was that he could see forward that this wasn't going to be an anomaly for the Jews.
excellent point. But I want to move on to another point right now. Okay,
So,
good point. Right, he saw the future. Excellent. Okay, so what I want.
Possible for Hashem to say no.
Right.
You've got to go.
Right. Well, God, and that's what God said. We're stiff-necked people. We just have to use it for a good thing. But you all said beautiful things, and I love doing this kind of exercise every once in a while. Is because for me, number one, it's good to see what people think, right? Because we've learned. We're all holding on different levels. We are different level of education. We started learning at different times in our lives, but especially someone like Moshe. We've all heard about Moshe at one point of our lives. And I think this is something important to sometimes to stop and reflect, because so many times we think that we don't know things. So many times we think that we just don't have knowledge, right? We just don't know anything, right? And then since we don't know anything, whatever, because I'm not going to go to shul because I'm going to feel like an idiot. Right, I'm not going to go to whatever because I'm going to feel like whatever. Right, and I'm going to be hanging out with other people. There's a chavruta learning or whatever, and I'm going to feel like whatever. I don't really know anything. I'm not going to have anything to whatever it is. We so many times put ourselves down. Right, we've so many times put ourselves down, and by putting ourselves down, we hinder ourselves from growing. And we don't understand. We don't realize how much knowledge we do have. We just have to. We just have to pull it out of ourselves sometimes. We have to stop and say, no, I do know a little bit. Yes, there's always more to learn. I might have tons to learn, but I do know something. I do know something. And look, you all have beautiful answers. Right? You knew something, right? You all knew something. And that's something always powerful to reflect on. My Rebbe in 8th grade, Rebbe Greenbaum, still an 8th grade Rebbe in the same school, right? My nephews have him now. And I remember him saying from his rabbi, We say in the Meir prayer, I want to jump right back into Moshe. Right? We say in the Meir prayer, we say that we should, right before the Shemona Esrei, we say, Hasar satam ofanenu macharenu. God should remove the evil inclination from in front of us and from behind us. Now, we all understand what it means to remove the evil inclination from before us, right? All the distractions of the world, right? All the things that we're not supposed to do, all the places we're not supposed to go, right? Everything that's in front of us, the evil inclination is trying to make us cheat in our business, lie, eat things we're not supposed to, talk in a way we're not supposed to, unfortunately hurt people's feelings, whatever it is, right? A slew of things, not to go to prayer, whatever it is, right? But shouldn't the evil inclination stay behind us? Like, why are we trying to get rid of the evil inclination from behind us? Stay behind, stay behind. So there's many different ideas, and I've spoken about this in the past, but I want to bring out a new idea that I was thinking of a little while ago. Right? This is not what I heard from my rabbi, but he asked this question. And I think that sometimes behind us means to say it's reflecting of us, the evil inclinations keep us from looking behind us, from knowing our past, knowing what we have gained, knowing what we have grown. Because the only way to grow is by knowing where you were. Then you could see where you are today. Let me explain. I call it the Bubby syndrome. I think I might have spoken about this right before Rosh Hashanah. Right? It's called the Bubby syndrome. What's my Bubby syndrome? Bubby syndrome is like this. I remember when I was a kid, my grandparents lived in New York. I grew up in Toronto, right? My mother's parents lived in New York. And when we go, right, my grandmother, when we came, said, "Oh, look how tall you've got." Never heard that from my parents. I would say, "Look at your stomach." No, right? But right, I've never heard them say, "Look how tall you've got." Why not? Exactly. Because they see all the time, and we just become more gal. We get accustomed to it, and it's very small, very, very small. So we don't really see the growth. But Bubby, right, who this Bubby doesn't live in the same city that I grew up in, right? She hasn't seen me in a few months, and I grew in those few months. So she remembers when I was like this, and I went like that, right? So now she said, "Oh, look how tall we've got." And we do that to ourselves all the time. We do this to ourselves in our spiritual growth all the time. So many times, right, we don't realize that we're growing. We don't realize that we've acquired knowledge. We don't realize that we've taken steps in our spirituality because we just get used to it, which is good because it makes it easier. But there's danger behind that because we're not propelled to do more. It's, look, I've gone to, what have I grown? I mean, what have you grown, right? Think about what you were 5 years ago. Think about what you were 10 years ago. Think about where you were a year ago. There was a fellow in Jacksonville. I still try to learn with him on Zoom every once in a while. Right? We would do a yearly report. Businesses do a yearly report and look at their loss and gains. And we used to get together, right? We used to study, and but once a year, I would say, okay, I said, okay, we're doing a yearly report next time. Right? And he knew what that meant. What was it? We would stop and reflect. Say where were we from last year? What have we grown? Right? Oh, you start putting a kippah when you go to Jewish events. Right? Oh, you started saying the Tefillah Sedayim, start washing your hands, wherever he was holding at that time. And we would do a yearly report, and he would reflect and say, wow, look, I'm taking that next step. Because if we don't do that yearly report, that's macharenu. The HR doesn't want us to look back sometimes. It doesn't want us to realize. He just wants us to get comfortable where we are and say, look, I'm not growing, I'm not changing, so why should I move more forward? When we realize that we have grown, that gives us the energy and the strength to say, if I was able to overcome that, if I was able to stop eating pork, if I was able to stop driving on Shabbat, if I was able to start coming to shul once a week, so why can't I start coming to shul twice a week? Right? Why can't I starting to go to more class? Why can't I start making a blessing not only on a Tefillah Sedayim, but I can start making a blessing on bread? Right? Whatever it is, right? Wherever one's holding. But if I was able to do that, I could do the next thing. Right? And that's macharenu. So it's important to remind ourselves that we do know knowledge. Right? It's important to stop ourselves. Okay, what do I know about Mosh? What do I know about Aaron? What do I know about this week's parsha from previous years? Now, okay, this year I want to learn a little more. Right? I want to grow from what I have. Okay, so now let's learn more a little bit about Moshe. So you guys said wonderful things about Moshe. I want to start off with a fundamental idea of what Moshe represents, which a lot of the things that you guys spoke about ties into it. And then we'll talk about a few other things of what Moshe Rabbeinu represents, right? We find in the Torah, the first thing that the Torah really tells us about Moshe as an individual, not about his birth, not about how he came to be, right? But about his individual. What's the first story that the Torah tells us? It says, Vayigdal Anar, he grew up. He went out to his brothers and he saw B'siv Losam and he saw their suffering. Right? Says the Medrash Rabbah, the Midrash says, what does that mean? Mahu Vayar, Shayaroa B'siv Losam Uboche. He saw their pain and he cried. Omer, and he said, Chavali Aleichem, Mitein Masa Aleichem. Woe is to me for you that I could do something for you. The first thing that Moshe Rabbeinu does, the first thing that the Torah tells us about Moshe Rabbeinu was not that he knew the whole Talmud, was not that he knew the whole code of Jewish law, right? That's not the first thing. You have to have that. Right? That's not the first thing that the Torah tells us about Moshe. The first thing that the Torah tells us about Moshe as being able to be a leader, Vayar b'siv losam, he saw their suffering. It doesn't say that he did something about their suffering, because he said, Chaval alai, unfortunate for me that I can't do anything about it. But even though he knew he couldn't do anything about it at the time, Vayar, he saw their pain. And that is something that so many times we don't do. We don't see people's pain. We don't see people's suffering. We don't see people's needs and wants. We don't see people at all. There's I don't remember if I said this last one I spoke before Rosh Hashanah, right? But there was a famous pianist, right? That I don't remember his name. I don't have my notes in front of me, but there's this pianist that was playing in Washington, D.C., right? In this fancy, opera house. And sorry, not pianist, but guitar. He played the violin. Thank you. Right? He was playing. No, it wasn't a Jewish person, right? Right? He plays the violin, right? And there was this big concert. The tickets were hundreds of dollars, very expensive. So there was this person that was a friend of his who was doing a study on human nature and things like that. So he asked him if he could do him a favor. He said, "Could you do me a favor? Take the same violin, right? It's a very expensive violin, but put on rags." Right, and get your face a little dirty, like just color it or whatever, make it a little dirty, right? And go into the train station, right? One of the famous train stations. Open up your case, put it down, sit on the floor or stand, because you're playing the violin, and play your violin and play the same piece that you're going to play tomorrow, right? In the orchestra, and you know what happened? You got a few pennies, right? People just walk by. These same people might be paying hundreds of dollars. They could hear the same piece, the same beauty, right? The same talent of being able to move the notes. And I don't even know music that well, so I'm not even going to try to explain it, right? They spend hundreds of dollars, but they could have heard the same thing for free. Because Lo Rayar, he saw the person. That was actually their pain. But Vayar, the first thing the Torah tells us, the first thing of a leader, and again, all of us on our levels of leadership, we have to see that there's someone in front of us. We have to see that there's a student in front of us. We have to see that there's a child in front of us. We have to see that there's a spouse in front of us. We have to see that there's a colleague and a friend and a human being in front of us. That is the first level of leadership. When you have this level of leadership, Midrash continues and says that God said, right? Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ata hanicha oseka v'alachti liros b'tzarch Yisrael. You stopped. You put aside your fears, right? He was living in the palace. Put aside. He's here to see my children, right? I will move the heavens and the earth and I'll talk to you. And he became the leader. It's the first thing that the Torah tells us by Moshe Rabbeinu. It's the first step of humanity. First step of whatever level of leadership that we're dealing with. You have to recognize if you have someone in front of you. You have to give the time of day to every human being. Now, yes, leaders have to know how to compartmentalize and to be able to say, listen, this is not the right time to talk, whatever it is. Right? And sometimes you have to put other things aside to talk to this person because you see that they're in a distress. That's the first level, right, of being able to see that they are human beings. Any comments or questions on this?
You mean compassion, right? And there's not just seeing them, right?
Before that, this is step number one. Step number one is just recognizing there's someone in front of you. People just walk by people. You ever stood in 2nd Avenue, right, in Manhattan, right? You don't even have to go to 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. Just go to the mall over here, which is not such a big mall, right? If you just stand there, people are going to walk right by you, right? If you have, there was this thing going around. I don't know if you guys saw it, right? Baruch Hashem was a big Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name. But they one of these like Jay Leno kind of things. I don't remember who it was, but right, they went. It was in Hollywood, right, or in LA, it's a famous street in LA, and they had one of their people dressed like SpongeBob, right, and big SpongeBob thing, and he fell. Whatever, he'd make himself fall, right by a bus stop or whatever, big busy street, and he fell. And they wanted to see how long he couldn't get up by himself. It was big, SpongeBob, kind of thing, right? And they wanted to see they were doing, to see how long will it take for people to stop and help this person. And it was I have it probably somewhere on my phone, right? It was crazy. People walked over his legs, right? People just walked around. Right, and he's saying, "Please help me, please help. I can't get up. Please help me." Right, you could see the person's face, right? And please help me, I can't get up. People are just walking around. Some people like turn back and smile and move on, right? And Baruch Hashem was a big Kiddush Hashem, right? I think it was like 30 seconds, 40 seconds, or maybe a few minutes, right? A few yeshiva bachrim that walked by, right? And they asked right away. I said, "Oh, can we help you?" And they lift him up, right? And then they dance with him, but that was a Kiddush Hashem, recognizing that there's someone there. Step number one, yes, of course, with compassion, but first and foremost, we have to recognize that someone's there. Recognizing someone's there is not just saying, "Oh, okay," but and sure, do we recognize that there's someone new that walked in? We recognize that someone new walked in, right? I'm saying yes. I'm just saying, right? In a lot of places, not necessarily. And maybe you do, but how about someone else? It's not just a shul thing. It's everybody. It's a component of each individual, right? Do you recognize? Do you realize that? Do you see people? That's step number one. Vayar, he saw. That's step number one. What's step number two? Right. Step number two is the Torah tells us after that. Right, and yes, compassion. He had compassion. He cared about them, right? So seeing and then understanding their pain, right? And that's step number two. Step number two is he saw them, and then what the Torah tells us is not only did he see them, but he felt their pain, right? My father told me, my father learned in the mirror in Jerusalem a long time ago, right? In the late 60s. Right, late 60s, early 70s, and Rav Chaim Shmulevitz. I mean a long time ago, way before I was there, right? But Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, right, was the Rosh Yeshiva at the time. Great Torah sage, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, and he said that the family used to hide. There was like a Jewish paper that would be printed, like a local paper, and they would hide the paper from him. Why? Because unfortunately, papers a lot of times have sad stories in them. Right, you don't really find good stories, right? The whole push, good stories, but they don't sell, right? So a lot of times papers have sad stories, and when Rav Chaim Shmulevitz would read about someone's ills, he literally took the pain to himself, and he would break down and start crying. And the family, he had a yeshiva. Every day they felt bad for him, so he used to hide the paper. Even without seeing the paper, people always came to him and with their woes and their troubles. But just to see how far it means to really feel the person, right? That's what it really means. He literally took their pain. He literally felt their pain. That's step number 1 and 2, sort of same, seeing the person and then seeing the person's feeling their pain, being part of their, just taken upon themselves. But step number 2, right? The opposite of that is what the Torah tells us the next day. And Vayetz b'yom hasheni, he went out the second day, right? And he saw 2 Ivrim, two Jewish people, right? And they were fighting with each other. And one tried to hit the other one. He says, Russia, lama shakarecha, Russia, evil person, why are you hitting the other person? And the person said, who made you the king upon us? Who made you the leader upon us? Right? And didn't you kill the person from yesterday? And that's the story from yesterday where the Mitzri was hitting the person. And he said, the thing is known, and that's when he ran away to Midian. So the commentators explain what's the second day, really the next day is like what the Torah tells us it was the next day. What's the purpose of saying it was the next day, right? What's the purpose of the story? Okay, it's leading to Moshe going on a Midian. But the 2 stories being right next to each other, there's a lesson that a leader, yes, you have to see every person and you have to have compassion for every person. But a leader also has to have backbone. A leader also has to say, Russia, this is not the right thing that you're doing. Right? A leader can't say, well, I feel bad and this and that, and okay, if this is how you feel. No. A leader has to be able to also say what is right and wrong. Russia, lama sakarecha, why are you hitting? The leader has to do it when a leader has compassion like Moshe, right? And a leader. So then people will realize he's just trying to teach us. That's what a leader is trying to teach us, trying to get us on the right direction. And it has to be done with compassion. It has to be done in a way that will be heard. But a leader has to say what's right and wrong. And if you have a leader that doesn't tell you what's right and wrong, he's not a leader. Because you're not going to grow that way.
From the mind, the heart, right, where he knows it, but then he takes the action, right?
Right. So the mind and the heart, that's another whole discussion. How does the mind and the heart work? I don't want to get too out. We got off topic a lot today, right? But the relationship, what goes first, the mind or the heart?
What usually?
I'm not saying scientifically. Scientifically, the heart really doesn't do anything. But. So in Shema, right? In Shema, right? What do we say first? Let's when we put on our tefillin, we put on a tefillin in the hand, and then we put on tefillin in the head, right? Right? And when we put on the tefillin in the hand first, and then we put on tefillin in the head, right? It says that you should put it on your hand and you put it on your forehead. Comments on why the hand first? Oh, that's what we do. Why? Right? Why the hand first? Why do we put the head on first and then put the hand on? Right? It's closer to the heart. Why? It's because the heart represents our desires. Our heart represents our needs and our wants. And in the end of the day, our needs and our wants, if they're not aligned with the Torah, right, they could convince the mind anything. People think they're doing things intellectually, they're doing what they're doing. Intellectually, it's the right thing to kill out the Jewish people because of the Aryan race. Right? Intellectually, it's the right thing to work on Shabbat because we need to put bread on the table. Right? I'm not judging, God forbid, I'm not judging anything, I'm just giving you examples. Right? But we intellectually, right, are governed by our needs and our wants. Right? And therefore, we have to put the fill on the hand first, right? Al yadecha, make sure the heart is realizing that we have our struggles, we have our challenges, but overall, we are striving to be with God. And then we can put it on our head, because then our head's going to be in sync with our heart, right? I don't want to get too off topic on that. We could talk a whole class on that. Right? But back to our discussion about Moshe, right? So back to our discussion about Moshe, right? So this is 1 and 2 complement each other, right? One is, number one, you have to see, you have to have that compassion. And number 2 is you have to be a leader, right? That also, right, says what's right and wrong. You got to be able to be a leader that says what's right and wrong. Otherwise, you're not a leader. You're just making people feel good, which is important. You're not a leader. All right. I wanna move on to another point, which some of you spoke about a little bit, right? But I want to expand on that. But before we do that, I mentioned I wanted to speak about Miriam also a little bit, right? His sister. Right? So we see these ideas by Miriam also. And on one hand, right, Miriam, right, as we know, she was one of the midwives, right? The Midrash tells us she was one of the midwives. She took care, she took care of the babies, right? She put her life on the line to see every individual, to see every person. Right? She stood outside wanting to, after Moshe was put into the Nile, right? She stood and watched what was going to happen. And we see this in other aspects of Miriam too. Miriam, it says a be'er, the well of water, was in the merit of Miriam. Be'er Miriam is called. The merit of, why that? Why the water? Right? Why the water? Right? It's because water, first of all, sustains us. Right? We can't live without water. Okay, we can't live without food either. And we can't live without water. But also, water is something that, if you look at it, reflects back at you. You see your own reflection. And when you look at the water, you see your reflection. Miriam, everybody felt like they were able to. Miriam saw every person, just like the water. Miriam saw every person, their reflection in her. Right? That's why the water, which sustains. We need bread also to be sustained. But Miriam had this character trait where she saw every person. Right? She cared about every individual, but at the same time, right? She gave it to her father. Right? Her father separated from his wife because Paro made a decree. And she said, Dad, you're worse than Paro. Right? Last week we had Moshe telling his father, right? That's very different because we were talking about Amram, who was Nasi, the head of the Jewish people, great rabbi, right? But she said, you're worse than your father, than Paro, because your decree, Paro only decreed against the boys, and you're decreeing against both the boys and the girls. And you know what happened? Amram said, hey, that's a smart cookie you are, right? Okay. And he listened to her. But Miriam stood her ground, right? So we see the same idea, right? This family trait, these leadership traits of Miriam and Moshe, right? Similar in different areas, we see the same concept of you have to have this balance. Okay, let's move on to the next point. Next point I want to talk about is that I forgot, I think you brought it up, right? Maybe it wasn't, but I remember, right? About the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe Rabbeinu seeked advice from other people, right? Seeked advice from other people. So we see it on the most basic level, right? And we'll start with the basic level. Right, he asked his father-in-law for advice, and his father-in-law gave him his father-in-law gave him advice, right, about how to do the whole Jewish system. He was standing day and night judging the Jewish people, and in Parshas Yitro, right, Yisro gives advice. You should divide it. The heads of hundreds, the heads of this, right? The Supreme Court, Circuit Court, all the different courts. And he said, "Okay, good point." Right? A good leader, and like his father, just like his father who accepted advice from his daughter, right? A good leader realizes when there's value in other people's opinion. I want to take it even a step further, right? And this is something that sometimes is missed by people, right? And I think this brings out such a powerful point of not only taking advice, but realizing the responsibility of where you are. What do I mean? It says like this. It says that when Moshe Rabbeinu after God spoke to Moshe, yes, in the whole story, I'm I can't speak properly. Though finally, after a whole negotiation, right? Moshe accepts he's going to go to Mitzrayim with Aaron, his brother. He goes back, right, and he asks his father-in-law permission to go. Torah says, right? He asks his Chosno, and it's a go. Why are you asking your father-in-law to go? Right? God told you to go. Right? God told him to go. Right? The Jewish people. So if his father-in-law said no, right, said no Pesach, right? We don't have to clean for Pesach anymore, right? No matzah. What's going on over here? Right? Why did he go and ask his father-in-law?
We're showing respect.
That's one good answer, right? And that's a legitimate answer, right? It was more ceremonial to show respect, right? He lived by him, showing respect. Commentators give another answer. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he came to Midian, right? Moshe Rabbeinu was a refugee. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu was a refugee. He was escaping. He was, his life was on the line, and Yisro took him in. Not only did he take him in, he brought him into the family business. He was shepherd, and he gave him one of his daughters. So it was more than just showing respect. Right? He had a responsibility to Yisro because Yisro saved his life. And he made a commitment with Yisro. By making that commitment for Yisro, yes, God told him to go. And yes, the Jewish people needed him. But that doesn't take away from what the laws of responsibility and the laws of making a contract or whatever it is. I'm exactly a contract or not, right? But taking away from that he had to ask permission. He had to ask permission. This is on a deeper level of recognizing so many times, right? Each one of us on our own level, when we get so, we take on a leadership role or we take on volunteering. And trust me, I'm the first one that encourages volunteers. Right? I've been working in non-for-profits for over 10 years now. Right? We rely on volunteers all the time. But we also have to realize that we have other responsibilities. We have our spouses, we have our children, right? We have other responsibilities. Yes, they're most probably, if you're a good couple, and they said, go and do it. Don't just accept something without asking permission. It's not asking permission, it's discussing it. Right? Don't just come home and say, well, hey, honey, I just volunteered to be in synagogue all day, Sunday, right? So if you know that your spouse knows that you've done this, and sort of, that's an underwritten permission, like discussion. But there is responsibility. And this a lot of times happens more often. It's a different age group, but a lot of times happens with children. A lot of times this happens with children. The children, the responsibility that parents have for their children, it's great that they're doing all this chesed in the community, and they're giving up a lot of their time. They can't forget about the responsibility that they have for their children. And I try really hard to study with my kids. I tried very hard to eat supper with my kids every night, right? Thank God, usually we do. That is, you have to know what your responsibilities are. And as a leader, you also have to know your responsibilities for your community. And you have to know how to balance that responsibility. So that's a tremendous lesson that sometimes is not talked about. A lot of time we talk about this. We also have to see that Mosh Rabbeinu, one of the greatest leaders of all time, right, had responsibilities, and he first had to get that permission. The whole Jewish nation, right? With the greatest level of volunteering, right? Doing the makos, splitting the sea, right? It doesn't compare to, what we're talking about. Second, Yisro, have a responsibility to you. Are we good or not? That is a level of responsibility. Not only did he accept advice from other people, right? Not only did he recognize other people, but he also recognized what his responsibilities to the people that are nothing to do with his mission. Nothing to do with this big mitzvah that he wants to do. This big literature, nothing to do with, no, I have to take care of that. That's something that I have to take care of. So that's another important lesson that we have to learn from Moshe. Any questions or comments on that? Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so I want to talk about another interesting idea. Right? Another interesting idea that we see about Moshe, right, is 1 second. Yeah. Okay, so it says like this. It says, right, right, it says like this. It says that we spoke about last week, right, the difference between a Moshel and a Melech. Right? Remember we spoke about that last week a little bit. Maybe we didn't. No, we didn't. Okay. Now we did. I guess we didn't. Right? There's a difference between a Moshel is a ruler, right? Like a dictator kind of ruler, and then a Melech is a king. Right? So we find it says Hashem Moshel Bagoyim, right? But we say Hashem Melech, Hashem is the king. And I said, what's the difference? We say, well, it's just synonyms, it's different words for the same meaning. No, in Judaism, there's no such concept. Right? In Judaism, and if there's another word for something, to say there's something different in between there. And so the commentators explain like this: that a Moshel, right? A Moshel is someone that is controlling everything. Right? It's someone that is he's controlling everything. He's someone that doesn't give opportunity. He's Moshe. He doesn't give opportunity for other people to do anything. Right? Like a dictator kind of situation. Right? A melech. Right? The Jewish people had a melech. We didn't have a Moshe. We had a melech. A melech is someone that brings other people up and encourages them and allows them to develop. Right, and that's how the government or society grows, and that's a melech, right? So Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe Rabbeinu is known as a melech, and we'll talk about David HaMelech next week. Next week we'll talk about David HaMelech, King David, and Rus a little bit, right? Next week, God willing, right? But so we'll talk more about this idea. We'll talk about David HaMelech as a melech, but Moshe Rabbeinu also had this character traits where Moshe Rabbeinu always tried to recognize what other people had. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu he gave other people the job to run with the Mishkan. Right? One of the greatest architectural, right, fundraising, right, biggest job, right, the Shekhinah, divine presence will be there. No, he gave someone else the opportunity. The fundraising part, right, we understand why, right, but right, but he gave someone else. He gave other people to run it. Right? We see that he encouraged Aaron's children of educating them to become the next leaders. And we see that Moshe Rabbeinu, he got Aaron involved. And Moshe Rabbeinu was not someone that wanted everything for himself. On the contrary, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted a team effort. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted conversation. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to bring everybody together to be able to take that next step. And you know where we find this on the highest level? And on the most difficult level, the place where we so many times could I don't want to use the word fail because it might not be considered failing, because just because we're not on the level of Moshe, that doesn't mean to say we're failing. But on a level that we won't attain Moshe's level, with the story of Dasan and Aviram, right? Who are Dasan and Aviram? It's the story of Korach, right? When Korach won and rebelled against Moshe, right? So Moshe Rabbeinu reaches out to Dasan and Aviram. Let's talk. And Dasan and Aviram was troublemakers. Your typical troublemakers, always making trouble for Moshe, right? And he reaches out to them. And what do they say? He said, "Oh, not only did because it was right after the story happened, right after the sin of the spies. So God told them that they're not going to go until they say, "Oh, you're not taking us to the land of Israel, and you don't take care of us. We're not coming. We're not coming." But the commentary is, why did Moshe Rabbeinu even reach out to them? They were troublemakers. They were known as the troublemakers throughout the Torah. They were the instigators of everything. Okay, they were with Korah. Moshe Rabbeinu talks to the Jewish people. Why is he reaching out to them? Because that was Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to give everybody the opportunity to change, to grow. I'm not a dictator. I'm not just going to give my ruling and give my thing from my throne and that's it. No, he gets his hands dirty, right? He goes down to the people. He says, come, let's schmooze, let's talk about this. Let's figure out what the problem is. Even to Dustin and Avira, even to them, who are the greatest troublemakers. No, let's try to work this out. And what does Moshe Rabbeinu tell afterwards to God when they said no and they slandered him? He said, "Lo chamor echad I didn't even take one donkey from them. I didn't take one donkey from them. I took nothing from them." That's another sign of a leader, right? It's not easy, right? And that's from the leader perspective. I'm not saying from the congregational perspective, but you shouldn't be reliant from favors from your congregation, from your people, because that sometimes could skew the way you look at things. Hanifa, it's called bribery on a very little level. I'm not saying the congregation shouldn't offer things, right? That's a different point. But from their perspective, I'm not saying this they accept. There's many calculations, and it's a very fine line. I'm bringing out a point, right? But most Rabbeinu said, "Look, I didn't take anything from them. They can't say, oh, I took this out. You fit nothing. I didn't take one thing from them." Most Rabbeinu reached out to them. That's a leader, reaching out to the other side, right? Saying, no, we gotta try to have a dialogue. But again, when he saw that there was no hope, he said, Hashem, deal with them. We can't. You gotta still be strong. You can't just, we try to reach out to the other side, but you can't be pulled into the other side either. Very important to remember that. Sometimes we try to reach to the other side so much we get pulled into the other side. We can't do that. After Moshe Rabbeinu saw that he did what he felt was his effort of trying to make peace, trying to rectify the situation, and he said, Hashem, you got to deal with this. And as I said, the whole camp of Korach will die in a unique way, because we have to stop this plague of descent away from Hashem and people going away from the leadership. We have to show that no, Hashem did talk to you, right? We have to show this. And he made, yes, unfortunately people died. And yes, it was a harsh decree, but for the greater good of the Jewish people, this had to happen. And that's a tremendous point that we see throughout the Torah, that this is something that a lot of times, and especially I feel that in our generation, it's something a little harder for us to comprehend sometimes, because we're living in a generation where everything's kumbaya, everything's great, and we realize everything, it's beautiful. But it's detrimental too, because no one has values, no one has what they believe in, right? They don't have any content to why or what they're doing in their lives. And that seeps into our Judaism too, seeps into our relationship with Hashem. And sometimes we want to be so kumbaya and so this that we unfortunately get pulled into the other side. We get rid of some of our values. We have to be strong about our values, be strong of what we believe. That's not a contradiction to reaching out to the other side. Because Moshe Rabbeinu reached out to the other side, but he didn't give up on his values. And we said sometimes you have to, unfortunately, cut your losses. Haka Eshina, the Rasha, we knock out his teeth. Why do we knock out the Rasha's tooth? Right? Why his tooth? So the commentators say, because if you have no teeth, you can't speak. Right? It's very hard to speak. It's unbelievable. God's creation, right? What the teeth is what allows the sound to come out properly. We can chew properly without our teeth, right? It's unbelievable. God's creation is magnificent. It's unbelievable. But if you have no teeth, you can't speak. So the Rasha, who we reached out and we try to have a conversation, we invite him to the Seder. We reached out. We invite him to the Seder. Come. But then he asked in a condescending way without wanting an answer, right? Mocking everything. We have to knock out his teeth in a metaphoric way. We have to say, sometimes we just have to cut the line. Doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't continue reaching out privately, but if it's affecting you, you're at the Seder. There's other people around. The influence could affect other people. This is something that you have to speak to a rabbi, and you have to have das Torah of how, because it's a very delicate thing. And what's the cutoff line? What's not the cutoff line? And even when you do that cutoff line for the kids of the family, you still have a relationship. It's not simple. You should never be in such a situation. But as a community, we also have to realize that we are in those situations all the time. Mosh Rabbeinu, that was the leadership of Mosh Rabbeinu, who was able to do that. Right? Just one more idea. And then we'll wrap it up. 1 second. One more idea of Mosh Rabbeinu's leadership, right? You know, unfortunately, we sound a lot of times here, right? It happens in the Jewish world too. Unfortunately, it happens. But you know, when a matriarch or patriarch of an institution or a family dies, right? There's a lot of times, unfortunately, fighting amongst family members, right? Over the inheritance, over the business. Right? If there's a family business, right? Who's going to run what? Right. And unfortunately, it happens in yeshivot also. If there's like a father or a yeshiva and there's 2 children, right? They unfortunately sometimes also who's going to take over, right? It's a human nature, unfortunately, right? When death happens, this is something that families have to really are put to a test, of what their level of relationship is. I'll tell you one thing: the Mir Yeshiva, right, where I studied also, not just a few years ago, right, right. The Mir Yeshiva was known as the epitome of excellence in this idea. What do I mean? When the Mir Yeshiva moved to Israel, so Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, as I mentioned before, he was Rosh Yeshiva. He had a few sons, right, but his eldest, Rav Shmulevitz, and he had a few son-in-laws, right, and his eldest son-in-law was Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. Right? And then he had another son-in-law. He had Rav Nachum Partzovitz, right, who was also one of the Rosh Yeshivas, right? And then he had a few kids. So there's a lot of people to discuss, let's say in a nice way, who's going to take over. And everybody at the time, this happened before I was born. He passed away. He actually passed away the year I was born, right? It was known in anybody that knew that the way things went down was the most beautiful way and the most Torah-dic way. Rav Shmulevitz, who I learned under, who passed away a few years ago, who was Rav Chaim's eldest son, right? Rav Chaim's eldest son, right? He went publicly and said Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel should be the Rosh Yeshiva, the eldest son-in-law. Publicly.
Son-in-law.
Yeah.
The son said.
Yeah. And so what they did was they made both of them as Rosh Yeshivas. And he said, no, he should. So both became Rosh Yeshivas. But Rav Shmulevitz, he always put himself second to Nosson Tzvi Finkel. And vice versa. And Nosson Tzvi Finkel felt he was second to him. And they had a strong relationship. And the children of Nachum Partzovitz, who was Rav Chaim's brother-in-law, right, who also theoretically, right, they all accepted it. And when Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel passed away, this is a few years back, about 10 years ago, same thing happened. He had a bunch of kids, and there was much more family involved, right? Because there's much more. But they realized what's the proper way of living it. But we see something from Mosh Rabbeinu. Now, Mosh Rabbeinu knew human nature, and when we're dealing with the whole Jewish people, he avoided the whole situation. What does the Torah say? And we're going to end with this. I know it's getting late. I'm sorry. It says like this. V'yidaber Moshe, all right, Hashem lemor. And Hashem spoke to God saying, Yifkod Hashem elokei haruchos l'chol basar ish al ha'eda. Right? God, right? I'm just going to paraphrase it. God, living of all souls, appoint a man over the community. And this is the beginning of the story of God telling Moshe to choose Yeshua to be the next leader. And not only that, right? Moshe anointed Yeshua while he was alive to let the Jewish people know that Yeshua is going to be taking over. Now remember, we're dealing with a lot of people, a lot of great people. And we had Kalev, We had all the Nisim, right? We had some great leaders. There could have been an all-out war. God forbid, which it wouldn't have, because we're dealing with lofty people. But Moshe Rabbeinu avoided all this by anointing Yeshua before he passed away. Passing the baton before that there'll be no problems. That is a leader. You were mentioning before, Chacham Eina Barosho. A leader sees the future, right? You were mentioning that before. A leader sees the future. Moshe Rabbeinu understood human nature. He understood what needed to be done, right? That's why it's so important to make sure that you have a will, right? And it's clear, right? It is a mitzvah, actually. It is a mitzvah to make sure that you have a will. It's a mitzvah, right? To make sure that you know, right? What the kids know what's going on, besides legally and things like that, right? But these are important concepts, right? To try to avoid machlokas. And this is not only on such a level of death. This is also when we're dealing a leader, right? When you're introducing a new program or you're trying to introduce a new idea, right? You have to have thought of how to do it in a way that it's not going to bring machlokas. Now, it's not going to be foolproof, especially because the verse in it, so he said, sometimes you just have to, this is the growth, but you have to have chachma, you have to think ahead, you have to try to make sure that things don't break out of control. And that, my friends, is what Moshe Rabbeinu was. And Moshe Rabbeinu was someone, right, who, as Rashi on this says, what do you mean, ish al ha'eda, a man over the community? Moshe Rabbeinu was saying of what he was, as we start in the beginning, and I'll read you the English. Rashi said, what is it written? Moses said before God that a personality of each individual is revealed before you. They do not resemble each other. Appoint for them a leader who will be able to bear each individual according to his or her personality. That is a leader. Vayar, he saw people. A leader has to see that there's different people, there's different personalities, right? Different people are interested in different things. That is a leader. Ra, being able to see, also seeing what the outcome could be. Like Moshe Rabbeinu first appointed Yeshua. At the same time, as we mentioned, you can't be pulled to the other side. We saw by Dasan and Mir, Moshe said, enough. We said, Rosh Hashanah Sakarecha, don't hit your friend. Yet at the same time, you have to know how to balance that. And we have to expect that out of our leaders. We don't want a leader that's just a pushover. At the same time, and also the concept of responsibility of listening to other people's advice and realizing, and the responsibility of realizing that you have responsibility for other people. Israel. That is someone that is truly thinking about other people. Thank you all for joining me today. I appreciate